Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining our discussion today. I'm Jean McElvain, the Interim Director and Associate Curator at the Goldstein Museum of Design, which is part of the College of Design here at the University of Minnesota. We're delighted to have all of you here, and before beginning, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that the University of Minnesota is located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. The university resides on Dakota land ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. I also just wanted to take a moment to say that all of our programming is made possible in part by the voters of Minnesota through a Minnesota State Arts Board Operation Support Grant, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, and a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts. We're also funded, of course, by generous donors in the College of Design. I'd also like to introduce the co-curator of this exhibition and my co-presenter, Colleen Pokorny, who is currently a PhD student in apparel studies with a minor in museum studies at the University of Minnesota. She also holds a master's degree in apparel studies from Minnesota. Colleen is the Dora A.G. Waller Collection Assistant at the Goldstein Museum, and her research interests include the intersection of quilt making and upcycled fashion, quilt making innovations, and 3D body scanning anthropometry. So to begin with, everyone, this is a collections-based exhibition that attempted to dig into the concept of design decades, which is really kind of arbitrary. We tend to kind of neatly pack aesthetics into decades, but there's a lot of interpretations of that. Some might think of the 80s as big hair and bright colors, while others think of it as corporate ladders or Atari consoles or hip hop music scene. The point is that there are many frames of reference, making the look of any one era pretty idiosyncratic. We developed 4 major themes for structuring the exhibition, and we certainly recognize that while people are on site, they may not be able to associate objects with the 4 themes, but for us, it's very helpful in defining our narrative. One common element that kind of resurfaced was a tension in the 80s or around that era between reviving the past and being intentional about being divergent and individualistic. Also, the idea of commodification of individuality and diversity was a huge part of kind of late 20th century capitalism. So today I'm going to talk briefly about retrofuturism and deconstructing design, and then we'll hand it over to Colleen to talk about irreverence and heritage within this era. So retrofuturism is not really about the future. In fact, futurism is not really about the future. As one scholar says, futurism is people's imagination about the future in the past, while retrofuturism is recollection and reflection of this imagination. So that's clear as mud, isn't it? So design in the 80s and surrounding years pulled a lot of inspiration from historical trends, from culturally diverse backgrounds, and technological advancement, which we wanted to come through in the exhibition. So here to begin with, we see that the 80s often pulled style lines from the 1940s and 50s, but this tendency to revisit past styles was not necessarily, conscious on the part of the designer. You can see a similar silhouette in the central red Bill Blass dress, which is in the exhibition. And the Lauren Bacall dress on the far left, which of course is an old Hollywood still. So this element of Hollywood glamour from the 40s was pushed to extreme in 1980s era television shows like Dallas and Dynasty. So big hair, sparkles, and a lot of synthetic stuff challenged the really kind of countercultural earth conscious movement of the preceding 70s. So this ushered in kind of a whole new height of consumerism and disposability. And here's another example of retrofuturism from a much earlier time. So the angularity and repeated geometries of the 20s and 30s are evident in this jacket by Yves Saint Laurent. Now, this jacket is nothing that a woman in the 20s or 30s would have worn. It was not the style of the times, but the era is kind of superficially then overlaid onto what was then, of course, a contemporary jacket. So there's a huge aesthetic piece to revival that lies outside of function. So here are some juicers from 1990 by designer Philippe Starck, who's French. And they really represent such a telling aesthetic response to the late 80s and early 1990s. So these juicers by Philippe Starck are notoriously bad from a functional perspective. Some designers in both Europe and the US were really tired of modern design's kind of practical democratizing approach, especially in Europe after World War II. There had been a huge push to design products in a way that were both widely approved of and relatively austere, which gave rise to this minimalist aesthetic. And these very much look like, you know, they predate that World War II era. But also ironically futuristic. Their aesthetic function here certainly overrides any hint of technological advancement or operational functionality. So today, when we think of technological advancement as something that is, you know, strongly associated with robotics or global communications, but especially that global communications piece, I mean, that was just not as present in the minds of average consumers during this 1980s era. However, Sony's Walkman, you know, is a little quaint in appearance when we look back at it now, but it had this, you know, massive impact on our expectations about individuality. It really enabled people to do something that they hadn't been able to before, which was to listen to music of their choice on the go. And if you think about how kind of revolutionary that is, it really resonated with people. It was a very insular way to look and listen to music. You know, you would put headphones on and it would be kind of about you. But over 400 million units of the Walkman sold during the 80s. I also have next to it an advertisement from the University of Minnesota Archives, from an alumni magazine, which is advertising all the different technologies available at the libraries at that time, including, you know, microfilms, record albums, newspapers, Lumina, audio cassette tapes. I mean, all of these things at the time were very new. And there was anxiety at that time also about technology and how it kind of robbed people of personal agency to think on their own. This is part of the kind of postmodern condition that we are considered victims of a hyper-mediated kind of consumer society. And this is before Facebook or Instagram. So this is kind of part of human evolution that we think of this as both a boon and a kind of something that could be really overly present in our lives. So while deconstruction as a design style is often associated with 1980s architecture, the philosophy behind it had been explored in a lot of fields, notably like comparative lit, and was certainly present in a wide array of design disciplines. Deconstructing really referred to, you know, breaking down preconceived notions of design, which led to a lot of pretty wide experimentation. So the suit that you see on the far left is certainly, it's a woman's suit, but obviously it's inspired by a man's tuxedo. And it really challenges the expectation of arriving to a party in a big kind of sexy ball gown. And women's, you know, increasing involvement in corporate culture in the 80s is evident in this kind of deconstruction of gender identities. And the dark purple men's suit by Versace, which is next to it, you know, also both maintained a really masculine silhouette with wide shoulders, but the soft kind of flowing material and details made it a little, you know, different than the highly crisp looks of its predecessors. One of the most influential style movements of the 80s comes out of the rap and hip hop scene, which really laid the groundwork for much of what we see going on now in high fashion. Influential groups like Run DMC or musicians like LL Cool J really made luxury items out of tracksuits and tennis shoes, which of course we see all the time now coming down the runway. So this type of movement from street style to high fashion is a product of the late 20th century's move to really high levels of individuality. So this essentially deconstructs what had been the fashion system by doing more of a street style up versus wealthy down in styling. And then finally, it affects everything down to heritage crafts like quilting. So artists like Jan Myers Newberry uses hand-dyed fabrics and 1.5 inch, teeny squares to kind of distort our conventional understanding of repeated quilt blocks. The quilt, which is named after an Emily Dickinson poem, Tell All the Truth, but Tell It Slant, combines a lot of strong diagonals, but you can see that it creates these kind of transparency illusions and also bursts through that kind of implied border around the edges of the quilt. And now I'll hand it over to Colleen.
Thank you, Jean. So now we're going to move into talking about irreverence, and to set the context for irreverence, I'm providing these two images, which are not pieces in our collection, but really sort of help show how things have changed. So by the 1980s, designers were becoming tired of the modernist stronghold on, quote, good design. And mid-century modern design had been highly prevalent through much of the mid-20th century. A group of Italian designers called the Memphis Group began to rethink the extreme minimalism and logic that had been admired for so long. On the left is an example of logic associated with an Eames storage unit from 1949, and we've juxtaposed this with an intentional disjointedness of a room divider on the right from Italian designer Ettore Sosas, a founder of the Memphis Group in the 1980s. The piece on the right no longer pays tribute to construction, and that element has been concealed. There's an intention here to present objects with illogical arrangements, such as angled shelving. Following the lead of the Memphis Group, designers broke from good design norms with bright colors, bold prints, and quirky details. But this new genre was really tied to the past and was mixing up things like 1960s pop art, 1950s kitsch, and 1920s Art Deco and reforming them with a sense of irreverence. Neon colors were certainly prominent during the 1980s. And this was a big change from those earthy color palettes that we were familiar with in the 70s. And while yes, there were bright colors in the 70s, the looks that we have in the 80s are more uptight and bold. And this center dress here by Stephen Sprouse, who took the bright youthfulness of the 1960s and ratcheted it up a notch. He had a line of clothing in day glow colors, which were absolutely electric in how deeply neon they were. Note the additional detail of the separated zipper, which is both subversive and smart. This application of something functional and transforming it into something ornamental had been done to an extent in the 30s and again in the 60s, but not to the extent that you were unzipping your garment into two separate pieces. Japanese designer Hane Mori has this elegant purple day dress, but it features a red lip print, a jarring visual on a sophisticated dress. What makes it irreverent is the overly feminized version of lips, which are disembodied and floating across the surface of the textile. We see this emphasis of abstracting the female body, voiding out facial features and replacing them with reductive elements like big lips repeatedly, such as this pin from Ide Maria and this watch. Part of what makes objects highly identifiable from the 1980s is bright color combinations. Bright primary colors and color blocking were commonly used during the era. What you're seeing here is not actually 4 purses, but really 2 purses. We have a purple and yellow combination handbag and a green and red combination handbag. What I really love about these is how the trim details really integrates all the color blocking scheme as well. So you see those same colors repeated over and over in the purses. And there's an emphasis here on aesthetics of the object as opposed to functionality, which was a key element to postmodern design. As Jean previously alluded to, there was a rise of pluralism in the 1980s, and that's a coexistence of a variety of cultural expressions in art and design. Pluralism ultimately led to commodification of differences, which of course can lead to cultural appropriation. So for example, this print on this jean mark ensemble bears striking resemblance to applique work from present day Benin. Increased interest in pursuing cultural identity and roots in the 60s and 70s transformed into this commercialization of non-Western design in the 1980s. Designers began to mix and match elements from multiple ethnic traditions, often presenting them out of context, similar to this ensemble. Multicultural textiles were used in Western silhouettes, providing consumers fresh takes on familiar forms. So pop culture would have us remember the 80s as a style of excess and big hair and bright colors, just like I was talking about. But underneath all of this is really an undercurrent of nostalgia and sort of this longing to connect with an imagined yesteryear. Designers tapped into these sentimental feelings by breathing new life into traditional cultural silhouettes and techniques. In the section on Heritage Rebooted, we looked at how history had been cut up and reassembled for a new generation of consumers. Quote, "In fashion, sometimes the only way to move forward is to look to the past." During the 1980s, analog watches began to lose ground in the market to new digital watches. Swatch, which is a combo of Swiss plus watch, cleverly leveraged this deep heritage of Swiss watches by creating a line of relatively low price point and inexpensive bright plastic watches, and they came in a huge variety of designs and colors. Consumers tended to buy several watches, usually to go along with each individual outfit, which was really what Swatch was hoping for. The relationship between past Swiss design excellence is revisited in the Swatch print advertisement that you can see on the right from 1984. And it pulls directly from a 1936 travel poster by Swiss-American photographer and graphic designer Herbert Matter. This reference, of course, would have been lost on most consumers. With its fully pleated skirt and buttoned up high neck collar and puff sleeves, the Ralph Lauren ensemble on the left really emulates a lot of late 1800s American prairie styling. And this was repopularized in the media by TV shows such as Little House on the Prairie. The resemblance to this historic 1885 photograph is uncanny. Ralph Lauren, though, has updated the prairie dress with oversized plaid and a muted pastel color for a more contemporary audience. Similarly, the center white dress here by Norma Kamali pulls from historic Euro-American dress. It bears a striking resemblance to an early 1900s lingerie dress. Whereas the 1900s lingerie dress would have been worn over foundation garments to create a desired S-shaped silhouette, the 1980s version reflects more of a freeing and celebration of the female form, although it should be noted that this dress did still have shoulder pads. Moving beyond Western historical references, there was a wave of Japanese designers in the 1980s, and they opened up the Western world's eyes to new concepts about how body and clothing should interact, which were rooted in Japanese heritage and design. The ensemble on the left shows Issey Miyake's deep connection to traditional Japanese textiles and silhouettes. The rough textural fabrics embody textiles produced by rural Japanese weavers, and the silhouette's simplicity and organic shapes reflect Miyake's in-depth study of the relationship of the kimono and the body. On the right, Kenzo Takada's asymmetric closure, boxy cut, and heavily gathered pants are a mix of design elements pulled from traditional Japanese men's ensembles. But the traditional floral textile patterns have been reworked in exuberant pop colors, befitting of the 1980s. Towards the end of the 1970s, thousands of Hmong immigrated to the United States from Southeast Asia due to the Vietnam War. And with them, they brought their exquisite textile arts and a language that was stored in symbols that were worked into the cloth. While many of the symbols' original meanings have been lost over time, or they convey different interpretations, depending on the tribe that the maker has originated from, these designs continue to serve as a visual language for the culture. Hmong women use their textile arts to maintain their culture and history and as a form of economic survival within the United States. So here we have some examples of some different Hmong techniques, including cross stitch, batik, and applique. And the bottom two panels are a form of reverse applique, which is one of the most difficult Hmong crafts to learn. It requires a lot of precision cutting and tiny invisible stitching, and sort of imagine making a paper snowflake out of fabric and then having to hide all of those edges. And that's what they go through to make these. These panels feature the curling elephant's foot motif, which you can see in the centers, which traditionally symbolizes the family unit. So I want to wrap up our tour of Totally Radical with this image from Hennepin Avenue in Minneapolis from 1984. And Hennepin Avenue is a primary artery through Minneapolis, And during the 1980s, a variety of styles could be seen walking down the street. I really want to note the contrast between the counterculture punk youths that you have on the left and the clean-cut look of the women's athletic team passing on the right. This picture really sums up many of the themes from this exhibition, that there were many frames of reference in the 1980s, making the look of the era more idiosyncratic than one initially thinks. We cannot help but see the world through our experiences, but through Totally Radical, we are hoping that you can reconsider our collective understanding of this era and explore a more nuanced version of past times.